Hi everyone, my name's Ranger Stewart, and welcome to Bastrop State Park. Today I want to talk to you about a neat amphibian native to Texas called the Houston toad. What's an amphibian? Well, amphibians include salamanders, toads, and frogs, and the important thing about amphibians is that they spend a large part of their life cycle in the water. You may have heard of the term metamorphosis, like in butterflies and moths. Well, frogs and toads undergo metamorphosis too, and that's where that term amphibian comes into play. You see, all frogs and toads, they're born in the water in eggs, and the Houston toad is no exception. But when they grow up and they hatch after a couple of weeks, they hatch into tadpoles. They kind of look like little fish, and they have to live in the water. These tadpoles change. That's where metamorphosis comes in, the change in the shape of the body of the tadpole into a toad. Unlike frogs, toads, including the Houston toad, spend the vast majority of their adult life on land. But the Houston toad has some very specific requirements for its habitat. Habitat just means its home, but that's what we say for animals. So the Houston toad's habitat is very, very specific. Do you know somebody that likes to keep their house a certain way? Well, the Houston toad absolutely has very, very specific, very, very tidy requirements for its home. So what does the Houston toad need to survive? Well, the main thing it needs is sand, and lots of sand. Deep, sandy soils. Soil is another term we use for dirt, and sand is like what you see in a sandbox. It needs to be deep for the Houston toad to be able to survive, and it also needs tree cover, which we call the canopy. That's the really tall trees above us, like you can see around me above my head. Now here at Bastrop State Park, we have lots of sandy soil, and we have nice tall canopy in some areas of the park. What the Houston toad doesn't like is really, really brushy stuff. So plants that are about as tall as me don't really work for the Houston toad. They need grasses that are about a foot tall, those sandy soils, and tall trees. If we have too many plants that are in between the tall trees and the grasses, the Houston toad is not going to lay its eggs. Those conditions only exist in certain parts of the state, mostly in East Central Texas, like here at Bastrop State Park. But they only exist if we try to keep it that way. Because back in the past, we used to have what were called wildfires. Fires that would come by every few years and clear out all that brush that's about my height, so you still had your tall trees, and you had your shorter grasses, which the Houston toad likes. Got rid of all that brushy stuff. But now, without fire being on the landscape, we have less of that habitat, that home, that the Houston toad needs to breed and survive. So, how does Bastrop State Park try to help the Houston toad? Well, in order to try to help the Houston toad and make better habitat, we try to use what's called prescribed fire, where we bring fire back into the land to make sure that the Houston toad has a home for the future. Another factor that hurts the Houston toad and causes it to be endangered, endangered means there aren't as many as there used to be, and that their habitat is hurting, and their population, that means how many of them there are, is lower than it used to be. Endangered species like the Houston toad have very specific breeding requirements as well. So one of the main things they need is water so that their tadpoles can live, like I mentioned earlier, as amphibians. But Houston toads, again, are kind of picky, and I want to make sure that everybody, when they visit Bastrop State Park, knows what to look out for to make sure that they leave Houston toads alone. Their tadpoles need shallow ponds, but they can't last too long. They have to be seasonal, which means the ponds dry up when it's dry and they fill up when it's wet. If they're not seasonal, if they're full of water too long, like the water that's below me on this bridge, then fish, snakes, and other predators, things that will eat the baby Houston toads, will eat all the eggs. And that's not going to work out for an endangered species. But if it's too dry, then where are the Houston toads going to lay their eggs? They're not going to have anywhere to lay their eggs. So they need these very, very particular, these very specific conditions for their habitat so that they have a nice home for their babies. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about what you can do to help the Houston toad. If you're at Bastrop State Park, or if you're anywhere in Houston toad range, I would like to encourage you to make sure that you don't mess with any puddles that you see. Don't let your dog run into them, and make sure that you leave that home for the Houston toad. I also want to make sure if you're hiking here We have one of our favorite rules at state parks is to stay on the trail. Well, that's really important when there could potentially be some baby toads hopping around. We want to make sure that they can grow up safe in this environment. And lastly, make sure you learn as much as you can about the Houston toad. I highly recommend that you go research more about the Houston toad, and that's one of the best things you can do to help this species out. As always, check out Texas Parks and Wildlife's websites to learn more about this cool amphibian, and hope to see you on the trail.